Okay. And we've mentioned a few times regional transmission organization. How we work today, there are still these bilateral markets. Again, what I told you about the Biltmore House that started 100 and something years ago. We still do that today. The guy who sits 10 feet away from me in the office that I work, he is making the phone calls to people around Florida saying, well, we use instant messages today, but sometimes you use a phone call. You will say, I have 50 megawatts to sell. My price is $30 a megawatt hour. Are you interested? They may come back and say, no, but I'll buy it at 28. Say, deal. And then you go through a process to kind of confirm that. Still goes on today, and I'll, with some maps here in a minute, show you where else that goes on besides Florida. There are these regional transmission organizations that I'll talk more about. And again, I mentioned it earlier though, but there are other places where it's kind of neither of the two, but I guess an RTO would just look like a central market. I mean, if you think of it that way, from an operational standpoint, all an RTO looks like is a much bigger single utility. So one entity that owns all the wires. Maybe you've seen this figure before that shows what the RTOs and ISOs are in the state. By the way, an ISO is one of these entities that's only within one state. An RTO covers a regional thing. There's a few other subtle differences. And it's also because one was the result, I think, of the Energy Policy Act of 1992. The other one was the Energy Policy Act of 2000, and they had to come up with a new word. What? What? Are you saying that they've mislabeled themselves? Yes. And Midwest ISO? Yes. California ISO is correct. New York ISO is correct. These other ones, their names don't match kind of legally how they're formed. I think when they were initially formed, they were ISOs, but then when they redefined, came up with a new name, some of them are technically RTOs. It's way in the bowels of the legality of it. For our purposes, they're identical in what they do. It's just frustrating that they even use different names. So here's the Texas, and it is the part that's separated by DC ties. I mean, interesting, it doesn't serve this part of Texas. So that part is regulated federally, but this part is not, just these nuances. So when we talk about balancing authority, so from an operational standpoint, California operates, as California ISO operates everything within that footprint. ERCOT does everything there. And in these other regions, they'll have, I showed you the one picture of the big control room. Each of them, are you cold, Neil? You freezing? That big control room, each of these has one of these big massive control rooms, controls all of the generation within their footprint, all of the loads, all of the transmission wires, everything that goes on at a high voltage level, they do everything. Nothing to do with retail customers, anything going on there. In these gray areas, it's just the good old days of how it's been done for the last 100 years. I think I'll have another map here in a second, but to give you kind of relative size, again, I'll repeat again, I don't know that megawatts mean too much to you as to what's big in this case, what is small. PJM is certainly about the biggest market, I think, in the world. I think PJM is bigger than maybe any other country from an electricity standpoint. I don't know how big China has gotten this day. And these are a little dated. ERCOT, I think, is now more like a 70,000 megawatt peak. PJM may be more like 150,000. To put things in perspective, though, New England is only 25,000 megawatts. Well, I think FP&L is bigger than ISO New England. So if one of the arguments is, oh, well, you need to get everybody working together so you can be more efficient, get the economies of scale. Southern Company serves Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. They are certainly bigger than ISO New England. So it kind of puts it in perspective that if it's an economies of scale thing, better optimization within your footprint, there's some pretty big investor-owned utilities. This map starts to look a little bit too busy, but all of these circles are balancing authorities. And again, if you look back at ERCOT, well, ERCOT is an RTO, and it has one balancing authority operating all of that. It's up pretty clean up in New York and New England. Starts to get a little confusing in PJM. MISO, you got a little circle sitting out here. What is that? Well, believe it or not, even if you're within kind of the geographic boundaries, you don't have to play in their sandbox. And there were some people who said, no, no thanks, I don't want to join. And so there are some players. I think there's, which is that one? I think Arkansas Electric Cooperative does not play in that sandbox. Outside of the RTOs, and if you remember from this diagram, all this gray area here, these are just all independent control areas. Doesn't seem very efficient, I'll give you that. But there's 10 balancing authorities in Florida. Gainesville is their own balancing authority. So they have a control room, not quite as nice as what PJM has. It's located up at I-75 and 39th. I think it's up in Industrial Park there. Used to be over in Millhopper. But every one of these systems will have their control center. They do that whole balancing authority thing. They have what's called an energy management system. They do all of that controlling. And they do the scheduling of any bilateral type transactions that go out. Enough said about that. The RTOs are a large balancing authority that does everything that I've said. And they also run markets. They also run a flea market for different products that I've categorized in these 4 things here. And I think you have talked about some of this. I'm going to drill into more of this of capacity, energy, ancillary services, and FTRs. So I think I asked you earlier to think about it. So what is energy? Who's got a good definition of energy? You guys nervous to answer that?
The amount of power spent over time.
But he used the word power. I was going to challenge power. Power is the rate at which you deliver energy. So you may be backwards there. You know, if you look it up from a physics definition, and I'll admit I actually pulled it up again this morning, and they call it the capacity to do work. Well, we've got something else we call capacity, so we're getting even more confusing here. You know, it's force through a distance is what it is. And you talk about a joule. You know, in the electric industry, we use kilowatt hours. Do you know why we use kilowatt hours instead of joules? I think in Canada they may use joules. Any guess? I don't think you'll know the answer is because it's just what these dumb utility people did. You know, they adopted a way they didn't want to use a joule. They wanted to use a watt hour, a kilowatt hour, megawatt hour, and it's kind of torture. I say it's torture in my business because I work with a lot of people do not know the difference between a megawatt and a megawatt hour. Doesn't matter how many times I explain. Do you know the difference between a mile and a mile per hour? Do you know the difference between what your speedometer measures and what your odometer measures? They go, yeah, I get that. So why, for the love of God, can't you get the difference between a megawatt and a megawatt hour? Drives me crazy. But anyway, so energy, I'll just throw it out there. I don't have, other than maybe for my own satisfaction, to say, damn it, I wish it was a little clearer that we were selling shoes or tangerines or something, but it's a little more abstract. Capacity we're going to talk about, it's really it's in what they say is at least Wikipedia gives us the definition. Capacity is like the size of the power plant. The horsepower in your car, for example, is it a 200 horsepower motor? It's a 500 megawatt generator, means it's capable of delivering energy at that rate. You know, megawatts, or the watt is the rate at which you're delivering energy. Ancillary services, I guess you guys have heard that phrase. You know, we always use analogies, or it's like this stuff is the beer and this is the foam on the beer kind of thing. But there's some other things that you have to do with a power plant, and they've created markets for them. The economists thinking if we put those on the flea market table, we can find a better optimization thing. And it kind of, if your head isn't hurting by talking through some of this, financial transmission rights is it's kind of a crazy thing. It's not very engineering in nature, but it's one of the products, so I wanted to kind of touch on that. The reasons they did this was to provide for competition. I hope that's clear. Again, these mistakes that were made, bad things that happened, people said we got to have more competition to make sure the transmission system is fair. Again, that was kind of for deregulation in general, but maybe the not so subtle thing here is that would you rather have some separate independent entity, ISO, it's an independent system operator, controlling all the transmission, or do you want Florida Power and Light pretending that they're being fair and say, oh yeah, I'll give you equal access to my transmission. So in Florida, we do a lot, moving a lot of energy over FP&L system. But we deal with FP&L's transmission system. So they claim that they have a wall, they keep them separate. Who knows? It's not perfect. ISO is a little bit closer to perfect, that it's a completely separate company that decides, is there space on my transmission line? Or when it comes time to kick somebody off because it's overloaded, who goes first? But I will say that from the energy markets that we started early talk about, some things do work. Obviously, if you have a bigger footprint and a computer is deciding exactly what each generator does, it's a pretty efficient process. So I'll give them that. It's just, probably won't get into all the details, but the capacity markets and some of these other things are just, in my mind, kind of nonsense. So parts of it work very well, some of it not well. So let's talk about some of these things in a little bit more detail as to what they do. And I wanted to touch on what some of the market mechanics are. And I don't know what you've kind of covered already in this class. We've talked a lot about bilateral transactions. Each system just kind of optimizes. This is what Gainesville does every day. They say, well, I have this fleet of generators. I might have some contracts that I have certain rights to do. I'm going to forecast my load. Here's my plan for tomorrow. I'm going to adapt throughout the day, maybe as certain things, units maybe come online that I didn't expect, or trip offline that I wasn't expecting. And they use a computer system, like hopefully that one picture of PJM displayed to do it. Visually, this maybe kind of helps shows what's going on. The blue line is like the load shape. I borrowed this from a utility that we managed out in Kansas, the western part of Kansas, that doesn't have too many customers. For what it's worth, you'll see their peak load is 14 megawatts. A little bit smaller than Gainesville at 500 megawatts. But the concept here is, well, here's the load that they're serving. I mean, and this could represent what the plan was for the next day. It could actually reflect, this is exactly what everything happened throughout the day. The idea is you have a cheap resource, you just run 24 hours a day. You have another resource, it's pretty cheap, but in the off-peak hours, you're actually buying from the market, is what this yellow here symbolizes. It usually is energy is very cheap during the off-peak period. And this I've kind of reflected that this system is running its own generation to serve that. You know, in theory, if they had a little bit more, they could make a phone call and say, I can sell you something if you want to buy it. A lot of times, though, in these cities' case, what they have is not less expensive than others, so they're not going to sell it. But that's kind of what it looks like. I'd say it's what it looks like in the bilateral world. It's in the same way as what it's going to look like in an RTO world. It's just different people making the decisions. You're not making phone calls. In the RTOs, the way it works, again, if you think of my flea market analogy, participants via a computer submit offers to sell their generation. Now, it kind of resembles exactly like I have a generator, it has this much capability, it takes this long to start, it costs this much to start. When it's running, it costs this much per hour just to run at minimum load, and every additional megawatt hour that I generate costs another. You got a whole list of parameters. You could submit it just as, here is my cost, please do with it as you want. Or you could say, I'm sneaky, I'm creative, I'm going to offer it in at this. It costs $30, but I'm going to offer it in at $35. You have that right in the markets. I'll say the economists will some claim that the only way it's going to work is you got to put in your costs. So I'll kind of leave that for some other discussion. But the idea is you are submitting an offer which is not necessarily your cost. Whereas from a bilateral world, the only thing you really deal with is cost. In this case, the seller has an opportunity to offer it in. I'm going to talk about loads in a minute, but the market knows what load it needs to serve. It takes in all this information of these offers. I mean, there may be 100 different companies send into the computer by about 11 a.m. in the morning. Here's what I have to sell, here are my prices. It runs what's called a unit commitment model in concert with an economic dispatch model, and I'll say in concert with a security analysis that goes along. Have you talked about those concepts? But unit commitment is just deciding which units am I going to turn on and off and when. Economic dispatch, even if you're planning for a forward period like tomorrow, you're saying, okay, once it's turned on, what level should I put it at? Because that's part of the math and the cost. Got to add them together to say, well, this scenario cost X, this one costs Y, what should I do? Security analysis, do you know what we're talking about there? Transmission constraints. I've got some examples I'm going to show you. What's that?
During the operation.
Yeah, it's that, you know, that you can't move an unlimited amount of power over a transmission line. And one of the key things is that getting from point A to point B, certain generators may not be able to do that because the lines get overloaded. You may have to crank up a more expensive unit. So there's two levels that they do, is they say, well, let's run what we think is the most optimal commitment in dispatch, and let's see if any lines are overloaded. And if they are, well, let's back off and make sure nothing's overloaded. So it's not as optimal, but it's the best you can do. But then you kind of go another level, and they'll run a contingency analysis and say, yeah, but what if that unit trips right there? Can we survive that event? There may be some transient stability issues and other things that they kind of get you to say, that's not going to work. So at the end of the day, they will circle through all of this and say, this is it. Here is our plan. It passes all of the tests that we have. And from that, we calculate the price. If there are no constraints, the price, and we'll talk about this in a minute, about locational marginal prices, LMPs, you guys have heard about those? The marginal part of it is what's the next megawatt hour going to cost. Everybody gets paid that in theory. But then there's some adjustments for losses. If security says, nope, transmission constraints do it, then you get in, did you guys use the phrase shadow pricing? You do your Lagrange multipliers on your constraints, and whatever number you come up with that relieves that constraint is called your shadow price. I don't know if you use that phrase. But anyway, there'll be a different price that it calculates. I got a pretty good example, hopefully we can follow, that shows how it works. Then interestingly, I wanted to point this out, say, okay, I'm pretending I'm not a bilateral market. I'm not operating like you yahoos down there in the southeast that have a big system. But all I really have is a big system. My computer figured out the optimal dispatch. And now I got to do what the bilateral guys do and figure out, can I sell something to the market next to me and buy something? Does PJM sell to MISO? Does MISO sell to SPP? So there's still that element of it. There was a paper that we circulated that if you haven't gotten to it, I'd suggest if you really want to understand these markets more, read it. It's by Eugene Litvinoff and a few others. It is the best paper for kind of in a condensed version that kind of explains a lot of things. And he's got this diagram in there. There may be one or two others that I use that kind of show all of the moving parts. I don't have time to kind of go through these details. But it's kind of interesting to see all the different things in that big fancy control room, and what the computers do is to look through what do they do the day before, you know, is their planning for certain activities. How do the markets work? Unit commitment, economic dispatch. They may have to do what's called a reliability unit commitment. They find out after the fact, they say, well, we still don't have enough units on. Let's turn a few more on because I'm concerned. And then at the tail end is a huge amount of, once you figure this all up, now I've got to figure out how do people get paid. In GRU's case, they run their system as they think is optimal. They're not worrying about how do they pay different utilities unless they do some bilateral transactions. All these market participants have to get paid through some very difficult rules. Takes a lot of people to keep track of all the money that's going on in RTOs. They have a day-ahead market and a real-time market. You guys familiar with those? You got a few people keep answering, shaking their heads. I just want to make sure I don't lose.
Well, you get into this, but I'm told we're in 5 minutes now.
Well,
An
observation about it. The market is not 5 minutes. The settlement period is 5 minutes. You don't submit offers for every 5 minutes. You submit an offer for an hour. Now, how they operate it and all and move units around, they will pay you on a 5-minute basis. So you settle on a 5-minute basis. They just don't torture you to actually submit 24 times 5 different offers during the day. So you have a day-ahead market. You submit it in the morning. You then settle in the real time. I won't go into those details, but an important part of it's the LMP. You guys kind of said you understood this. The marginal price is the cost of the next megawatt hour. It's usually pretty damn close to the last megawatt hour, but technically it's the next one. It is locational because it takes into account transmission constraints and losses. In observation, the generators, they get paid the LMP that's calculated at their substation, what we call a bus. I don't know if a bus is a familiar term to everybody here. Loads get paid kind of lumped up, like if Gainesville wasn't an RTO, there'd be a GRU load, 1 point. They'd all pay the same price. Maybe a subtle point that doesn't make too much. Other types of transactions pay differentials between point A and point B. So I wanted to work through an example, two things here to show how losses work, kind of give some curious answers. Let me set this up a little bit. You have a system with 2 generators and 1 load. It's a 600 megawatt load, 2 generators, each capable of 500 megawatts. The load, however, is located only at 1 bus. So at first blush, you'd say, well, there's losses associated with moving electricity from here to there. Why wouldn't we just all generate it, or as much as we can from the local one to avoid the losses? So you would think that the dispatch, well, maybe it should be 500 megawatts there, which is the limit, and 100 megawatts here. The actual answer is 300 megawatts out of this one and 305 out of that one. If you look at the cost for each block of energy out of it, you see that they progressively get more and more expensive. Now, this is actually kind of unrealistic for a generator. I don't know of any generators that start out at 10 and end up at 40. But it makes for a good illustration. But what you see is happening is that if they're both at 300 megawatts, what are the losses? The losses up there are 4.6 megawatts. So you got to serve about 605 megawatts is what the sum of those two are. What you find is the math has to take into account that you have these losses, and so therefore what's the optimal dispatch that they have. And they give little examples of this. I don't have time to kind of go into a lot of the details, but you guys, you know, in your spare time, you might play with some of these numbers. But what you're actually seeing that as you move from 20 megawatts up into 30, your marginal cost gets more and more expensive. It was 20. At 30, it's 300, so you're blending it. So at 302.5, your marginal cost is 20.25. And at 305, the marginal cost is 20.05. And so what you really find is, if you do the math, you'd say, well, at 300 and 305, my total system cost is 69.93.21. If I did shift from 200 to 400, it's about $1,000 more expensive. Huge difference. And the reason is because you're stepping up into a much more expensive operating point of a generator that dwarfs what the losses are. So again, I'm sure we'll circulate this presentation, but you might just tinker with that to understand it. It's an interesting thing to say, oh gosh, that's not the original dispatch I thought. I thought you'd go in a different direction. The reality is we've kind of distorted the cost of the generators, that maybe that's unrealistic. But at least it demonstrates how they go through the calculation. And for what it's worth, they handle it by calling it a penalty factor. And it's kind of opposite of what you'd think. They assume the reference bus is the first one on the left. They say the penalty factor is 1. But this penalty factor is 0.97, so they're saying, look, for optimization periods, let's pretend that $1 over here only cost you 97 cents. So it's doing an adjustment for losses. We could probably spend another hour on this, but I won't. But the next step, starting to feel a little more engineering-ish, is how about congestion? How does congestion work? And this is, to me, the most fundamental, awesome thing about LMPs. It had me stumped for a while when the markets first started up. It's a little bit busy because we got a lot of moving parts, but we're really just going to focus on a few pieces of it. We have 5 buses, A through E. 3 of them have loads, 4 of them have generators of different size and different costs. And for our purposes here, it's got a penalty factor to account for losses, because this is farther away from the load than this one is. It has a higher penalty. And so we'll just leave it at that and not worry about how that math works. So this is saying for a total load of 669 plus 17 megawatts of losses, this it calculates is the optimal dispatch of the system There are no lines overloaded, but the only one we're really going to focus on is this one anyway. So when I say we can kind of drill down. If we look at the numbers behind this, some interesting things. You see, well, it says I only need 2 units to serve that load. I can use my 2 cheapest units because I'm not violating any transmission constraints. The cost of this one is $10 a megawatt hour. The cost of this one is $14. I do some fun with the math, adjusted offer because of losses. Again, to me, I think it kind of confuses it, but the math all works out. And it's interesting that the reference plant, which has a penalty factor of 1, that's purely for losses. It's not even being run. So it just seems to make the math more troubling than it is. But what you see over here is you adjust for losses, and these numbers are the prices that all the generators get paid. Now these bottom 3 aren't running, so they're not making any money. But this guy, Alta, is getting paid $14 a megawatt hour. Its cost is $14 a megawatt hour. It is the marginal unit. It's not paying for capacity, but that's another 3-hour lecture. Brighton, its cost is 10. It's making $13.83, take into account losses, so it's actually making some money. Optimal solution, everything's good, other than Brighton and Alta are thinking, I'm still not making enough money to pay for this damn thing. But it works. Now what we see is a scenario where, well, what if the loads have increased to 900 megawatts, losses have increased, and if I don't do anything else, I'm at 258 megawatts on a line that can only hold 230. I got to do something. I got to redispatch. Now, off the top of your head, just looking at this, anybody know what unit do I need to back off to reduce those losses? Thinking, I got to back off Brighton. How many megawatts do you think I need to back off?
The difference on the series.
See, that's where it gets tricky. I mean, I'm not picking on you. That's what seems logical. I just need to back this one off, 28 megawatts and make it up someplace else. It's much more complicated than that, which really leads to a distortion in the LMP prices. In order to get to 230, I have to back this all the way down to 509. Now, we don't have the impedance of this network and everything, so you have to go a little bit on trust, but some of the megawatts that you back off, they don't all come off of that line. Some of them come off of this line. So you'd say, oh, okay, well, I thought all I had to do is back off, but the only way I could do that is if I had a DC line, I could control that, but I have AC. So you just have to take it on faith that in order to get that to 230 within its thermal limit, I have to back all the way off on 509. Now, if I look as to what did I ramp up, let's see, Alta was at 110, Park City was 100. Can I see where I ramped up? Which one ramped up? Solitude. I think I had to turn on Solitude. Where is Solitude? So it's over there. It says 520. Oh, it's 110. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong number. So it went to 196. It's a little different because there's losses. The loss calculation is different. So it went from 110 to 196. So it increased 86. The other one dropped a similar amount, 91. Again, the losses is the difference. And so I had to give up a $10 megawatt unit to go to $30 and rank up a $30 megawatt hour. Funny thing happened with the LMP. If you look at this table, again, we'll ignore the losses that go on, but I now have 4 units running. Brighton, whose cost is $10 a megawatt hour, is only getting $10 a megawatt hour because it cannot generate anymore, so you're not even getting the LMP that other people get. The guy at Solitude is getting his 30. Park City, its cost is 15, it's getting a little bit more, and Alta's getting 16. But the point is, not everybody's getting the same price because they can't solve the same constraint problem that they have. So if you get time and have reason to think about LMPs, this is a pretty good example of just show you how the moving parts work to kind of see how that all comes together. Because it's really one of the more perplexing things that you'd say, well, Brighton's sitting here, it's not even fully utilized, I'm available, how come all I'm getting is $10? And again, at first blush, you'd say, well, this conclusion doesn't make sense. But the math works, and this is what the markets do. And a lot of people in back rooms saying, okay, this is garbage. Why am I not getting paid? I got this nice nuclear unit in Pennsylvania. Why am I only getting $10? And the reason is because you can't get to Manhattan. So just physical constraints on the system. Like I said, it's a pretty good example. Ancillary services, again, I think maybe this is something you have focused a lot on. I throw voltage support. They don't run a market for that, but people get paid to provide megavar support to hold up the voltage. They do have markets for regulation and reserves. I don't think I say anything about it, but the concept is, if my unit's good for 500 megawatts, and it's the cheapest unit, you're going to run me at 500. But if it makes sense that you back me off 10 megawatts, so that I can give you a 10 megawatt buffer that you can then use me to provide regulation, you have to pay me at least what I was going to get paid for that 500 megawatts, and then some, or else I'm not going to participate. So it's that paying for that regulation, reserve, if you will, plus as you move around you get paid. So they've created a market for that, and people try to optimize between that. There's also contingency reserves. They have to hold a certain amount back to say, well, what if a unit trips offline? I don't want the lights to go out. Let's have some reserves. And so even your 500 megawatt unit, you may only run it at 550 because you're just sitting there waiting for somebody else to fall offline. Well, guess what? You got to pay me for that 50 megawatts. So that's what this market is going on. I don't have a numerical example of it, but I think it's kind of logical to see how it is. Some of the reserves are what's called spinning, which means it's physically it's synchronized to the grid in running. You've just backed it off. Other ones are just maybe peaking units that can start very quickly. Financial transmission rights, since it is one of the markets, it's a little more complex. Have you guys heard about FTRs? Sean, did you take them down the...
This is Morgan Stanley just sucking money out.
This is kind of crazy stuff. In the good old days, it's kind of like a table reservation at a restaurant. If you needed they have walk-in seating at some places, but you'd call and you'd say, well, I need a table for 10. And they say, well, that's your table. So when you're going to show up, I got 10. Now, they don't make you pay. But in the old world, and what we do in Florida, is I can pay in advance for the right to use a piece of that transmission. It's like reserving a certain space on an interstate highway. I could call up on the phone, type in via the computer, I'd like to reserve 100 megawatts from point A to point B. And they would come back and say, you got it. Rate in Florida would be like $5 a kilowatt month is what maybe a rate would be. In the RTOs, that goes away. They don't reserve physical paths, but what they give you in lieu of that is a financial right. They say, okay, financially, I will sell you the right to the price differential between point A and point B. So, in my example at the very last line here, I said, okay, so if I paid $1 a megawatt hour for the right to move 1 megawatt every hour of the month in November, which would cost me, $720, I have the right to move it from point A to point B. The way it is settled is if the price during the month was $25 at B and it's only $20 at A, you paid me $5 a megawatt hour. It's purely financial, but effectively it does the same, or financially it does the same thing as if you physically own the path. So unfortunately it's kind of a tough thing. There are actually people sitting at their desk just buy and sell that product. They don't own generators. They don't own load. Morgan Stanley is trading FTRs. And there's desks that make millions one year and then they lose millions the next year trading those kind of things. So I just at least wanted to touch on it. It's not really an engineering-ish kind of thing, but it is one of the markets that they trade. They also have capacity markets. And since we know so clearly what the difference is between capacity and energy, capacity being the capability, you need to make sure you have a certain amount of generation online to serve load. Some parts of the country, you need to have at least 12% more than what you forecast your peak in. Your peak to be in Florida, it's 20%. Well, some of these RTOs, they actually run a market to do that. And here's PJM's example, that they'd say, look, 3 years in advance, you people who have customers, you need to demonstrate to me that you have capacity. You have the right to the megawatts. Not talking about the energy, talking about the capacity. If you didn't get what you needed in that market, there's other ones that occur, what they call incremental markets. So this is how they describe it. The markets are all a little bit different. Texas doesn't believe you need such nonsense as capacity, so they don't even have capacity markets. People in SPP, they say, yeah, you need capacity, but you guys do that bilaterally. We're not running some kind of crazy auction. This is a very controversial thing, and it's close and dear to my heart because this is what I'm working to write some papers about. When you participate in the auction, they've created this nice little thing, just want to at least introduce. It's called a variable resource requirement, that though you think you're being all competitive, we're only going to let you make so much money. So when you offer it in, this line at the top tells you what is the maximum you can get from the auction. Doesn't matter what you offered it in at or what other people were looking to buy. That's the most you can get. And what it is, it's a measure of how many megawatts do you have on the system. In PJM system, they have about 160,000 megawatts. And they said, look, if you get to the point where people are offering in 170,000, 180,000, we're not going to pay you for the capacity. So it's kind of an interesting, yeah, it's an auction, yeah, it's free market, but oh, by the way, we've got this price cap that's on it. So I know that's kind of getting out there, but it's kind of the way PJM and some of the other markets do of using these curves. For some reason, they want it to be all free and open and have all this competition, and they don't care if you don't make money, but they'll be damned if you're going to make too much money, is kind of what the theme is, unfortunately. Some of the results have been, I figure these units, they're measured in dollars per megawatt day, but since about 10 years ago, these are the markets that are traded in PJM, just as an example. This bottom line, RTO, is kind of the general RTO, but they have a few regions that are constrained, and so they set a different price. If you build in there, it's more valuable at times. Maybe hard to say in PJM what it is, but if this were New York, you'd understand that capacity on Long Island is more expensive, more valuable than other parts of New York. So